This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Julia DiGangi. Her new book is Energy Rising, the Neuroscience of Leading with Emotional Power. Don't try to read too much into the title. It's exactly what you need to know. Whether you're an investor, whether you're a trader, whether you're an academic, whether you're just a regular person, the idea that there is certainty, the idea that there is no uncertainty. This is where we go today. You can't predict a damn thing. You can't know the future. But you still got to deal with your emotions. You still got to deal with what hits you every day and how you deal with it. Hey, that's going to set you apart. Success or failure. One of those timeless conversations. If I had to fast forward decades into the future, what we talk about today will still be what I would talk about decades into the future. Without any further delay from me, let's jump right into my guest today, Julia DiGangi, and talk about Energy Rising. I hope you enjoy.
We want people to engage in this idea of feelings that feel bad. I'm sure you've had these instances in your own life. Maybe it wasn't about pain. Maybe it was some of the work that you did with the market. If you want people to engage in a way that you're very convinced can be helpful to them, you need to communicate with them in a way that they're able to receive. I think it's this idea of how do we tell our messages in a way that are very authentic and also meet people in a way that is not like a 2x4 to the face.
Or you just do the best that you can, because ultimately, if we have to filter everything that we're possibly thinking through the system of everybody, we end up with what I'm going to share with you right now, which is, and you brought up leadership. I almost can't do leadership book interviews because leadership books today are like McDonald's Happy Meal. The books are written in such a way where there is no controversy. There is no there at all. For me, I'm like, hey, if the quote artist, if the author is going to write whatever they want to write, then let the chips fall where they may. If that author, if that individual does their homework, they do their research, then let the chips fall where they may.
Absolutely. And I think one of the core pieces I make in Energy Rising, let me just make this in a scientific argument, but I think you'll see how powerful the point is. We spend a lot of time, I don't make this point in Energy Rising, but if I had to distill all of my work down to a single question, and again, I work with managers, I work with the C-suite, I work with parents, I work with romantic couples. If I had to distill all of that work down to a single question, I could do it, and it would be this question. How do I get these people around me who matter a lot to me to change their behavior so that I don't have to feel the feelings I don't want to feel inside of my own body? In other words, I need you to be more accountable so I don't feel so frustrated. I need you to stop talking like that so I don't feel so stressed out. Everyone is doing this. And this is in the most clinical sense. This is codependency. In other words, I need you to change your behavior so that I don't feel feelings I don't like to feel inside my own body. Well, one of the great things about working with the brain is the brain is the great arbiter of our life. So if it doesn't work in alignment with our neurology, it's not going to work. So a lot of times what people are trying to do, you made a joke about the leadership genre, is let's say people are trying to inspire other people or motivate others. You see this in sales, you see this in politics, you see this in parenting. What people are trying to do is they're trying to, for example, motivate their children. They're trying to inspire their employees. They're trying to convince people to have the same political beliefs that they do, whatever. Well, that's not how emotion is transacted. Neuroscience tells us that emotion is a currency of contagion. It's a thing of contagion, meaning we catch each other's emotions similar to how we catch a cold. So, and you've had this happen a million times. You walk into a room, you're in a good mood, and A bunch of people are in a bad mood and your mood sinks. The converse is also true. You've walked into a room before where people are cracking up, you don't even know what they're laughing about, and you start to laugh. This is a really big thing and it's hard to metabolize. It will make sense. And this is why I think the work on emotional pain is so sacred and so transformative. Is if I truly want to motivate someone else, I promise you the best thing you can do is be more motivated. You want to be more inspiring to other people, then be more inspired inside of yourself. And this is not some woo-woo, everybody pat each other on the back, and this is really optimistic. This is the way emotions are transacted. And if you're trying to sustainably change behavior, you cannot sustainably change behavior without the emotional engine driving. This is why people can feel like, oh, yeah, this is a great idea, but they run out of the emotional energy and they can't sustain the behavior. I would much rather talk for 50 years about how all these idiots aren't doing enough for whatever, pick your political topic of the moment. But how am I really showing up in my own life? In other words, I would spend my whole life talking about how other people's behavior needs to change rather than embody the very emotional energy that I'm saying there needs to be more of. This is incredibly pragmatic.
Well, of course, I can see your point that if you say things like you just did, that does go against a lot of the modern narratives. As a Gen X guy, I say a lot of the modern narratives are, you might not like this phrasing, but it's a lot of hold hands, kumbaya. And I'm like, hold on, where's the productivity? I mean, I get for the moment, please tell me your pain, so to speak. Tell me how you're feeling. But at some stage of the game, okay, let's get to work. Let's do something. Whereas my observations of a lot of modern life are people, they understand their emotions to some degree, but they are stuck in how they use their emotions. They don't really have a system. They don't really have a plan on how to move forward. I see a lot of people that are stuck, and I almost want to say wallowing in emotions versus looking at emotions as you're describing them, as energy, ways that can be harnessed perhaps and used in a positive way. Whereas a lot of modern life is just, again, hear me roar, so to speak.
So you're saying that you think one of the foundational problems is this idea that people are just wallowing in their emotions?
That'd be my observation, yeah. I'm not sure where it started. You've brought up information. I think information has caused people to compare and contrast more than perhaps at any other point in history. Before, we were always like, well, okay, if that guy on the hill, he became the billionaire and you don't really pay attention to it too much. It's like, okay, whatever, he got lucky or he built something great or whatever. Whereas now everybody, regardless of effort, imagines having the same outcome. And this is creating, from my perspective, a lot of anxiety. Hold on, outcomes are uncertain. You can't predict this stuff. So you could work the same, quote, hard your whole life as the billionaire, or the billionaire didn't work as hard as you and he got the billion and you didn't. But you've got to accept that because that's life. That's how things unfold. But whereas we're in a place right now where people don't want to accept that, in my opinion.
Why do you think people don't want to accept it?
Because they've been told in many ways across various fronts, whether it's political, educational, media, they've been told they don't have to. They're not being told what you're telling people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not being told. They're being told that there is a way to make up ground without effort. There is a way to get there, or everything was against you. So you have a reason for where you are. We can solve it for you. And you don't necessarily have to do anything yourself because the system's going to solve it. This is a message that's out there. I can imagine that for someone like you, even though, again, I make the setup earlier, I say, hey, I can't find the hot button political stuff in your work. I just find practical, realistic. This is how things are. But I can imagine, like we discussed with some people not liking the word pain, that starts to become the whole rub in modern society. It's just a word. It has meaning, but it should not be causing you to freak out.
I hear what you're saying. There's this really important question, which is, were prior generations not freaking out, or were they avoiding the very conversation of it? So I think those are very, very different things neuropsychologically. So we know that, for example, avoidance of an issue is not the same as successful resolution of the issue. That's the first point. The second point I want to make that I think is really important for people to think about is the duality of what it means to be a human being and to be in human relationship. again, because I bring everything back to the brain, there are two competing neurobiological drives of the brain that give rise to every single human relational problem on the planet. I'm talking about the ones in your home. I'm talking about the ones with your kids. I'm talking the ones in your company. I'm talking the ones between nations. I always say the brain is the great clarifier. It gets to be not easy, but it does get to be simple. So there's these two equally important competing drives of the brain. The one drive is the neurobiological drive for dependence. This is connection. This is every ounce of relating is driven by this neurobiological drive for dependence. We see it the second babies are born. We see it cradle to grave, the cradle to grave phenomenon. The other equally important but exact opposite drive of the brain is the neurobiological drive for independence. We call this autonomy. We call this freedom. We call this choice. Now, the only reason there's a problem is if everybody could just have their own way of doing it, their own way of thinking about it, and nobody was perturbed, well, there would be no problem. The rub always happens when we start to say, my way is more right, and I need you to agree. So I don't care if you're talking about political issues, even your conceptualization about, I could imagine a person making an argument about emotion that said, all this processing of emotion is healthy. It hasn't been processed in this way. It hasn't been touched in this way for generation after generation after generation. And intergenerational transmission of trauma is a thing. It's not just conceptual. We know now, thanks to epigenetics, the study of genes and how genes and the environment interplay, that these things are passed down. So we're in a moment, I think, where people are now having a relationship that, number one, has historically never happened. And number two, because there's nobody to teach us yet how to have this level of relationship with emotion, it's messy. If you think about going back to neurology, the healthiest human brain is a brain that we call it's functionally integrated, meaning the brain thinks about what it feels and feels about what it thinks. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
All I wanted to say here is if we're thinking about how to be the most robust version of ourselves, both in our own life and also collectively in our homes and our society, we have got to figure out how to integrate the feeling system with the thinking system. And how in the world are we going to accommodate this idea of the drive for independence and the drive for dependence and the tension that it causes? And I will tell you, I think that, and this goes back to uncertainty again, the number one thing that causes so much pain on the planet, I could shout it from the rooftops, is the absolute need to be right. And the need to be right is always about certainty, because you will see people fight about being right, even when the right position is less rationally, I'm using air quotes, beneficial to them. For example, see, I knew nobody would like me. In other words, the need to be right, what that is really an expression of, is it is the pattern detector confirming the certain pattern. When I talk to you about understanding the energy of uncertainty, it is transformative, it is necessary, and if we're serious about evolution, you want to call it progress, whatever, we need to grapple intelligently with uncertainty tolerance. No one's talking about this. Why?
Well, here's the thing, though. You and I both know this, is that regardless, even in my world, the investing world, where uncertainty and dealing with it is par for the course and what you have to think about it, and especially in your world, too. But at the end of the day, given the human condition, the way we operate, one generation keeps passing and a new one keeps coming along, the chances for people to probably reach the point, given all the other stimuli coming at them, from politics, education, media, the chances for people like myself and you to influence large numbers is probably minor. We're going to get on the edges of the bell curve. We're going to nail some people and give them an eye opener. But I think it's going to be tough because it seems like most of society is set up to not have the conversation that you want to have. And they are being pounded nonstop with information that frankly is not in your headspace or my headspace.
Yeah, but Michael, I think if I'm understanding your worldview from this lovely conversation we're having, I think you're going to like this part, is I think there needs to be a growing conversation about the attentional economy and our own attentional power. As a neuropsychologist, I say that I study all these domains of cognition. So I study verbal memory, there's visual memory, there's information processing. The mother of all neurocognitive domains is attention. Because if you're not paying attention in the first place, there's not a problem you can solve. There's not a decision you can make. There's not even a thing you can remember. What I think is I watch other models of behavior and think, how could this be applied to the emotional power I'm on this planet to talk about? So you see people taking radical responsibility for their bodies, the things they're going to put in their bodies. They don't want to have toxins in their bodies. They don't want GMOs. Well, at some point, we got to say, and it's hard because of what technology and scrolling does to neurology. That's a real thing. But we've got to take radical responsibility for our attention and say, yeah, it's easier for me to scroll all night, but I'm not going to. I'm going to think about my attentional health. I'm going to think about my attentional hygiene. We know that dysregulation in the attentional systems dysregulate emotion. We've all had the experience where we just processed too many damn emails for the day and read too many articles, and we're in a foul mood. The reason is the circuits that control emotion are some of the same circuits that control attention. In other words, when I say that we feel and we think, a lot of the hubs in the brain that produce those things are one of the same. So I think what's coming, and what I want to lead this conversation, is this conversation about attentional and emotional power. We've never had it before because the amount of information is not going to go down. It's going to exponentially increase.
Do you think one of the reasons that someone like yourself, maybe myself as well, that we can, I'm not trying to say I'm perfect or I can deal with all the issues that you're talking about in a perfect way, but I do relate to this idea of not trying to control uncertainty and realizing it's there and that's life. But do you think there's some aspect here that when you develop in your life some sense of confidence about something, and not only do you have the confidence, but you can share that confidence and you get feedback where people do like it, then that loop puts you in a place, well, why am I going to worry too much about the inconsequential? I do what I do, and some people like it, probably some people don't like it, but that feedback loop keeps me going in a way. And whereas I think a lot of people don't necessarily go through life having that. Maybe they want it. Maybe they're desiring it. They want to share. They've done some homework. They've done some research on something, whatever. They want to share it. They want to get that feedback, but they don't have that opportunity. And so then sometimes maybe they end up, I want to say, fighting the small fights. They're fighting over small battles sometimes. Whereas if their brain was in a place where they could have this love of their life they're working on and the rest of the world, so to speak, would give them feedback, then that just feels so nice. And then some of the more petty stuff just becomes, and I'm not saying emotions are petty, I don't mean that by any stretch of imagination, but just maybe it brings the intensity down some to where you're not as worried, there's less anxiety, and you can see it more for what it is. The word pain on the page, it's just a word. Does that make sense how I'm framing that?
I think so. So let me take a stab at it and you can tell me if I misunderstood you or not. But what comes to mind when you're talking about that is there's no question that a human being cannot be meaningfully well and feel unworthy. What's important to understand here is so much of what the brain is doing is transacting outside of conscious awareness. And I don't know if you're going to like this one or not, Michael, but a lot of the injuries that we sustain, the way like our feelings get hurt or we feel like rejected, the adult in us knows it's not the end of the world. This idea about the need to be right, it is so ingrained in our neurology is we see it in lower species. So there's wonderful, and I can send you the links and you can share, but there are wonderful videos. There's TED Talks about this, where, for example, two macaque monkeys will get in a horrific fight because one monkey gets a grape and the other monkey gets a piece of celery. And the monkey who gets the piece of celery feels like it's wildly unjust. It's wildly unfair. So when we see a behavior that's conserved like that across evolution, what that tells us is it is so hardwired into our systems. I hear you asking, why do people sometimes lose the forest from the trees and get in these fights about things that you, Michael, are saying are meaningless? Well, it's because, and this is what I keep saying, and I think part of the reason Energy Rising is doing so well is because this message is really resonating with people. Yeah, I might be bickering about something with somebody about an article on social media, but it's not about the article. It's not about that specific situation. It's about the underlying energy, about who's more right, who's more important, who's more better. as a psychologist, I care about people's sense of worthiness. But the way I started to realize that this idea of really having inherent value, really individuals being able to say, I matter in the world, came through for me in my work with combat veterans. I've done a lot of work with combat veterans. So when these guys, I was working all with men, would come to see me, they were coming for PTSD treatment in most cases. I would say, as a civilian, I have a pretty good idea of what you're had PTSD about, what you were afraid of, dying. And what I was hearing across guys, across conflicts, across continents is, yes, I didn't want to die, but actually what was worse than that was being the guy on the mission who didn't have his shit together, was being the guy on the mission that other people couldn't depend on, was being the guy on the mission who did something that is unforgivable. In other words, what they were all saying was this idea of feeling fundamentally not good. And they were saying, I think this is really important too, is I was hearing this independently. In other words, they weren't all in a group where this was some big thing of groupthink. They were saying a fate worse than death was feeling like I was wrong, like I was bad. Now you could say, well, that's a really extreme example, and it is. But part of the reason I think it's so powerful is if you were facing death and you are saying worse than death would be the feeling of my own badness, that's mattering throughout all of human existence. And so what people I think are grappling with, especially in a world where everything seems very commoditized, there's a lot of people and a lot of information and a lot of options. How do I matter? And some people want to say this is a loosey-goosey I think you use the term kumbaya. It's not. This is a neurobiological conversation. And if you want to transform human behavior, you have got to work at the level of meaning, and you have got to work at the level of value.
That's a great question. How do I matter? That is it. And maybe that does sum up what I was laying out, and that you sum it up just really quickly in a few words. How do I matter? And if I observe people, and there's another sentence here that ties into this from your work, the leader is the person in the relationship with the strongest emotional energy. And so how do I matter? Well, I observe people, and I observe too many people who wear on their face, I don't matter. However, what they wear on their face is, I don't matter, but here's the fake mask to pretend that I matter. So for me, I'm really good at this. I can just see through it really fast. And I think sometimes they know I can see through it really fast. And so then there's that meeting in the minds where it's like, yeah, I see that mask and really don't think you matter right now, but you could matter. And that's the part, that's the real issue, is how do we get people to matter? That's the basic building block of society. And for me personally, as a guy who did not really enjoy college, did not really enjoy an MBA, and I found it was just all commoditized and frankly useless. Maybe I got unlucky with the degrees and the teachers and the students and whatever, but there was nothing in those classes about how do I matter. It was, Mike, memorize this crap and pass the test. So how do I matter is terribly important. Gosh, if there was a way that we could get that to be the question to help people with that, because instinctively, at least my observation too, I don't think most people have an instinctive feeling for how to find out how do I matter. They want to follow the steps they've been given by general society, but usually the only way to get to how do I matter is some solo journey with a lot of mistakes and a lot of ups and downs and this and that. But this is a great question. How do I matter?
I think you said that brilliantly. And I think what you're really saying is this journey, this solo journey with a lot of mistakes and a lot of twisty roads and a lot of uncertainty. So we are, as human beings, we are herd animals. There's all these fascinating studies out there. Our metabolism runs differently when we're sleeping around other people. We are so wired to be in community, which is so obvious that we couldn't live alone. The idea that we would follow the herd, it's wired into us. But the problem with this is this tension between the brain's drive for self, and the whole construct of self is really differentiation from other. So when I say these things are really in constant tension, the whole way that I understand that I'm a self is because I'm different from the other, but yet I need the other. And I want to be on some level aligned with the others. There is a lot of complexity here. But I think this thing about why do I matter? So energy rising is broken into 8, I call them neuroenergetic codes. They're these blueprints for how to work with your nervous system. One of the codes, I call it the source code. It's code 5. It's really about some of the core messages, the core patterning that we got in childhood. Now, what happens to the human brain in the first 3 years of life is astounding. It's like 1 million neural connections are being built every second. And what are we learning? We're not learning calculus. We're not learning about investments. We're not learning about clinical diagnoses. We are learning about the rhythm of relationships. We're learning about power. We're learning about attention. We're learning about who pays attention to us and when we matter and when we don't. So we're now carrying this source code in our life. You said, how do we get to know that we matter? And you made a great point earlier in the conversation. I understood you to say, it feels good when I get positive feedback from other people. Maybe my work gets accolades, but I don't need it. In other words, when I get the rewards of dependence, I get the affirmations, it's great, but I have enough power, I have enough confidence, I have enough competence to go it alone. Well, the fundamental precursor of all that for you, Michael, is a sense of worthiness. Now, some of us get to worthiness because our parents were really affirming. In other words, there's not just one road to worthiness. Some of us get to worthiness. We had horrible childhoods, but we heal along the way. The piece here that's inalienable for the human being is I have to believe in my own goodness. And if I don't have water in the tank, hopefully this happens to all of us in childhood, we need people, ideally our parents, teachers, other caretakers, to put water in the tank. You made a great point. If I don't feel like who I am in my isness, the isness of who I am, I will use Instagram filter after Instagram filter. I will plagiarize. I will cheat. You see what I'm saying? I have worked with every form of human behavior you could possibly imagine. And I will tell you, even the idea of psychopathy, this is the idea that people are true sociopaths. If you look at the epidemiological research, it's very rare. Even people who do bad things, and I'm not excusing the bad behavior. Of course, people need to be accountable. But if you're really interested in stopping it, you got to understand the cause. The cause is coming from an energy of fear. And the fear almost always is, I am not good.
The worthiness point that you bring up, and you've talked about the technology in this conversation, and this is a nice connection, I think, for people to be thinking about, because regardless of what age you are today, the internet essentially started in the summer of 1995. So this worthiness concept, this worthiness idea has now been put on steroids, because back in the day, perhaps one could be in Des Moines, Iowa in the 1950s, and you could run the local pharmacy and you would get the respect from your local community and people liked you. And you didn't have to worry about whether or not they cared about you in Boca Raton, Florida. And now, not only is it Boca Raton, it's the entire world. Maybe that's a little bit different because in my situation, I've got books all around the world in many different languages. So I do look at it globally. I'm gathering for probably most people, it's become at least just the entire country. So instead of worrying about Des Moines, Iowa, you're not worried about all of America, so to speak. I think this becomes really, really tricky. How do you find worthiness if your landscape is not just a small local landscape and your landscape is now vast? This is tough for people.
It is tough for people. I actually think this goes back to this idea of pain, this idea of emotional pain. I think that emotional pain is the most misunderstood energy on the planet. What I think there's tremendous power for example, social media, is we are being forced to reckon with our insecurities like never before. Is this going to create more insecurities? Yes. Is it also going to heal up insecurities like never before? Yes. What this means is I start to have to ask myself, if I want to talk, I'll just use myself as an example. I want to talk about emotional pain in ways that aren't common in the leadership space. So are there going to be people who disagree with me? Yes. Are there going to be people who don't like what I'm saying? Yes. Then I have to have this real reckoning with myself. And this now, here's this big buzzword, authenticity. Do I really mean it? If I really mean it, then I talk about this concept in Energy Rising that I say, pick a more powerful pain. So if I really mean it, the idea that we're all out there trying to have this pain-free existence, it's happening to all of us, and it's happening at the unconscious level because the brain is wired to keep you out of pain. But this is a problem because pain is like gravity, pain is like aging, it just is. So what happens is a lot of times in trying to avoid pain, we avoid the power in our life. So I put forth this concept in Energy Rising called pick a more powerful pain. So I have to say, if I'm going to say something that other people aren't going to agree with, Am I going to sort of double down on myself, or am I going to double down on the people pleasing? Well, if I double down on myself, I have to bear the pain of people who don't agree with me, who reject me. That doesn't feel good. I'm not going to lie to you. But you know what hurts worse? The self-abandonment. We're having a moment right now where people are talking a lot about psychological safety. There's really no question that the brain needs to have some degree of stability in order to function optimally. It's just so well documented. I think psychological safety is very important, but I think there's this piece missing from the conversation, which is how in the world does it matter if the whole world is safe to me as long as I'm willing to be dangerous to myself? If I repeatedly show up in ways that are not authentic, if I repeatedly want to speak up but keep my mouth shut, if I repeatedly say I'm exhausted but continue to overperform, in each of those moments, even if the world is delivered to me on a silver platter, I have showed myself that the dangerous person in the room is myself. There has to be this deep reckoning with my own emotional energy if I want to become the most evolved person that I possibly could be. Who is the most evolved version of myself? It's the version of myself that is predicated on smart neurology, meaning I know what I think what I know, and then I behave in alignment with those things.
I try to listen to other conversations sometimes, other podcasts or this or that. And most of it is so formulaic. And even at the beginning of our conversation, the way I phrased myself, I think you thought I was going to read a bunch of questions. And I can imagine that for many guests, some of these interviewers just have got a list of questions and they ask the things and it's robotic. Now, you know, after talking to me for a while, that I don't even have any questions. And no, I'm just having a conversation with you. But I also know that I think one of the reasons that what I do works, and I don't say this as a pat on my back or whatever, when I turn on the microphone, what I'm thinking, the conversation I'm having, that's what I put out. So it's authentic in that sense. And I think that's one of the reasons why so far people have listened, is because I try to keep it at that. Because if I turn on Fox or CNN or MSNBC, people really need to think about what that is. Those are people reading teleprompters. Those are people reading scripts that are being programmed by armies of other writers. Every word has been focus grouped and this and that. Whereas, back to your word pain, they've got a very precise way they're doing things, and it's not authentic. However, even though it's not authentic, clearly it's very addictive to large swaths of the population, because maybe they just don't get a chance to hear enough authentic conversations. And maybe the way the media systems are set up to just give people this stuff. I think you see where I'm going. It's tough to find the authentic. It's tough to find people that are being real and saying something. I feel very lucky, at least in my trading world. And you know this from Chicago. I had a chance to meet so many Chicago traders, old school 60s, 70s guys, and some ladies even too, some very successful Chicago trader ladies. And this attitude was very Midwest and very practical and very down to earth. And even if some of these folks had differing political positions, when it came to the way they dealt with uncertainty, when it came to the way they dealt with the markets, it was all the same. And I always found that so interesting. It's made me very, I don't know what the word would be, not necessarily confident, but just aware in a way where I think a lot of other people don't necessarily get that awareness. They don't get a chance to see behind the curtain and see how Oz is really operating.
I think that you're right, that we are on this journey to find what is most authentic. And some of us have further on that journey than others. But I think what you're saying is people can smell authenticity. I say that people can smell emotion. And the reason is emotion is our mother tongue. The universal, most primitive native language of every single human being on the planet is a language of emotion. And to be even more direct, it's a language of negative emotion. We all came out red-faced, screaming, hooting and hollering, rage, terror. So when we're around people that are authentic, we feel it.
Do you know how people hide it? And I think this is one reason why. And I do this in my voice. I don't do it necessarily consciously, but I modulate my voice. And I'm not afraid to. But a lot of people, if you listen to them and watch them, they're afraid to go up and down. They're afraid to put the emotion into their voice. They're afraid to let other people see it. For whatever reason, something happened in their life to where it's, I should just say this static. I should say this flat. I shouldn't add any extra here. And I think the extra is what gets people to be like, hold on, maybe there's something real going on over here because this person actually has some passion in what they're saying.
I think you're right. And I think this idea of what people really want, and this is, I think, the perennial conundrum of what it means to be human, is what people want more than anything else on the planet is access to their own power. And by power, I mean confidence, wholeness, authenticity, this idea of what I am is good, what I am is productive, what I am works. In other words, who I am as a person is good. Well, a lot of us got a lot of messages in all kinds of ways. How athletic we were, weren't, what kind of child we were, weren't. Our isness, our very essence wasn't okay. So I think a lot of us are trying to sit with this question, again, in varying degrees, is how do I walk it back to myself? And so I actually think a big part of this is this unbecoming. And unbecoming for a lot of us is dropping the performance. I work with a lot of really, really successful people who have every single metric of, I have people on my caseload who are billionaires. I have people on my caseload, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard the story. It sounds like trope because we've all heard it, except I live it every single day in my work. People who have nailed the externalities. Their company went IPO, they have the oceanfront property, they have all the things. And they're saying, I still don't feel good inside. Everything is mediated by emotion. I've had people who said, the day that I went IPO was the saddest day of my life. I had a great time at the party. By the time I got back to my condo, I was already feeling empty.
Like, I've had some success in my life, and whether the success stays where it's at or it goes much higher, I think I'd still be the same person. I think one of the things that's interesting about the points you're bringing up, and I'm curious your perspective on this too, I see it in people all the time. If I'm friends, family, whatever, I see the potential on their face. I see the uniqueness about what they have, and they don't see it. I just want to take that person and say, listen, there's some ways you can harness yourself, ways you can harness your emotions, ways you can harness your intellect, and you can be that thing you want to be, but they can't be that thing they want to be if the wall is there. And so I find almost in every individual that I've met ever in my life, I can see something unique in them. 19 out of 20 times, I can also see the wall that's probably going to never let them harness that uniqueness ever in this lifetime.
Yeah, but if you have that ability, I know this idea of leadership, I hear you say that it's cliche, but I think it's one of the most, if not the most powerful form of leadership. If you really can see people's uniqueness, what I call people's power, and you're able to, I call it speak life into them, speak power into them. It's the most life-giving thing. I'm a mother of two small kids, and I think my fundamental role is, yes, to connect to them. Here's that tension again between honoring the dependence, the connection, but also honoring the independence. I'm thinking every single day, I have a little journal. My husband and I sit down at the end of the day and we say two things. How did we speak connection into these children? And how did we speak competence? So this idea, my son in particular, he does things different than me. He always wears his clothes backwards. He does things that don't make any sense to me. If I'm not careful, I'm going to constantly be correcting that. How can I really speak the independence into this child? And I think what people want is an understanding that it's okay to be what we are. Well, the only way we're going to understand that is if there are people who model that. So this idea of really showing up authentically on your podcast, in your books, on social media, what could be more globe changing than that? I know that that sounds like pie in the sky, but until we're neurohacking, this is how human behavior changes.
This also sounds cliche, but as someone who's written 8 books, I will tell people all the time when I hear them speak, or if I get to know them and I see their point of view and I see something unique, I'll be like, you could absolutely write a book. And people are always looking at me like, you can just see it. What are you talking about? I can't do that. And I'm thinking, hold on, I never got above a C in English in college. What are you talking about? People don't see it in themselves. And sometimes it drives me crazy. I actually have influenced, I'd say probably a half dozen people I've influenced to write a book, probably, just in the sense of they knew my background and they knew, well, gosh, if that guy can do it, why can't I do it? But there's so many interesting perspectives out there, but it's how do you get people to see it in themselves? And again, back to the beginning of this conversation, how do you get people to look at emotions in a way more of how can I harness that energy versus the only negative aspects? Because I think a lot of people, if they hear the word emotion, it's instantly negative. Whereas, hold on, even a quote negative emotion could be positive depending on how you use it.
100%. And I'm not even here to say emotions are the greatest thing. Emotions are holier than everything else. I'm actually making a real neurobiological case. Emotions are like hunger. Emotions are like sleep. They just are. What kind of blows my mind is we've spent generations trying to pretend this energy isn't there. The very thing that we evaluate how much time we spend on social media or how our day was, or if we're going to write a book, how does it feel? It's the most powerful currency on the planet. It's emotion. And even you talked earlier today about productivity or money. I sometimes will do some work with people around money. You are in an emotional relationship with money. So money is about value. Value is inherently mediated by emotional systems. So tell me what it means to you. It means freedom. It means importance. It means safety, whatever. But it has to be mediated by emotion. So again, this idea of we can have a very reasonable, informative, really transformative conversation about emotion if we do it well. I think people who are no emotion are the exact foil, the exact character foil to people who are emotionally incontinent.
You brought something up. You said, now, how does it feel? And I think a good example would be this conversation. Ultimately, even if we don't understand the definitions set forth by a MICHAEL Csikszentmihalyi, if we don't understand the definitions of a flow state, it's what we're all searching for. We're all searching to be in this deep feeling moment where you forget about time. Even you, I know I did this to you because you were into the conversation and I know you were like, okay, let's talk for an hour. But then I can feel your personality. If she's enjoying herself, she's not going to really stop. So even if you want it to stop, you can't. And I understood that. Even though I said, well, you want to go a little bit longer? Then I realized, okay, she's not even looking at the clock right now. But that's fun. That's another part of all of this. At the end of the day, it's all about trying to have a nice feeling, to have some fun. You've got all these bombardments of everything hitting us, all of this uncertainty, the inability to predict. But then, hey, at the end of the day, we're still just trying to have a little fun too. It's okay to have some fun in whatever it is. So anyways, I think it's great stuff.
It is great stuff. Yes, you did a great job of hooking me into the conversation.
Well, we'll have to talk again in the future. Was this your first book?
It was, yes.
Usually the way this works, if you're not already aware of this, usually there's not just one.
I hear that and it reminds me of people who are like, I don't know if you have children or not, but people are like, are you going to have another child? You're like, what? No, are you out of your mind? It's a lot of work. It was a lot of energy. I'm still sitting with this one right now, but maybe I'll have to come to you for advice someday, but I can't imagine it right now.
The book, Energy Rising, the Neuroscience of Leading with Emotional Power. Julia, cool stuff. Very interesting. And I'm sure people will enjoy this perspective. Again, I have these conversations sometimes in this podcast where I don't plan it. I don't expect it. Even though somebody from an entirely different walk of life or a different area of research, and then it dovetails exactly within what my life path has gone down, just coming from a different perspective, a different angle. And I find that happens all the time. Maybe I'm self-selecting because when I either ask people to come on or someone tells me about a guest, maybe I'm self-selecting sometimes in who I pick because I can't make the leadership books work so far. They bore me to tears because they're not authentic.
Well, I really appreciate you taking an interest in Energy Rising and having this conversation about emotional power. I hope that my passion for this, I know that word's so overused, but I will tell you, I've been approached to do various TV shows and write different things. And I've always said no. I like to joke I'm a Midwest academic who likes to go to 2 good parties a year. And I spend the rest of the time in my office alone. When HBR approached me to write this book, I said yes. And I said yes enthusiastically because I feel like this relationship between emotional pain and emotional power is every other issue that we think about, whether it's global warming or equality or family systems, depends on how we intelligently meet human emotion.
I think also this is a particular topic where somebody said, hey, Julia, come on CNBC, or hey, Julia, come on CNN for 2 minutes. I don't know how you do it.
I would just blink like a deer in the headlight. Do you have 7 hours to talk about this? Because I don't know how to condense it.
Honestly, I don't even think, and this applies to my world too, I don't even think 2 minutes helps on those kinds of, even though it seems like a big megaphone and all that stuff, I don't think it helps. Whereas I do think that if people find these kinds of conversations on a podcast and they start listening and they start liking what's being said, 9 times out of 10, they say, well, I'm going to check that book out. I think it's a much better way to reach people.
I do like the long form, must be the academic in me, and you were a great host, but I like the conversations where we can really dig deep.
Hey, Julia, where can we send people? Is there a website you want to direct people to?
Absolutely. So I'm hanging out on social media like everyone these days. So you can find me at Dr. Julia DiGangi on LinkedIn, Dr. Julia DiGangi on Instagram. On Facebook, I'm just Julia DiGangi, and my website is drdrjuliadigangi.com.
Julia, cool stuff. Hopefully we can do it again.
Thank you, Michael. I had a wonderful time talking to you. Thanks so much for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.